Claudia Chender is leader of the NDP here in Nova Scotia and joins me for a conversation, a year-end wrap-up, if you will. Claudia Chender, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Todd.
All right, so it was a pretty big year for you, obviously, and I think looking back, I think have to be pleased with the year that was politically.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to be pleased because we are in a really difficult situation right now. Lots of Nova Scotian families are experiencing some challenges and as we head into the Christmas season. But yeah, I mean, I think we have an amazing team of MLAs who have been really working their tails off to amplify the, issues and concerns of Nova Scotians and to hold the government to account. And I think, by our measure, we've been pretty successful in doing that.
Yeah, when it comes to the NDP, how many MLAs do you have now?
We have 6.
Yeah, 6 MLAs. So 6 is obviously a starting point. You would like to form government. The goal would be, what is your long-term vision, I guess, is what I would ask.
Well, I have spent a lot of the last year, particularly the last 6 months, traveling around the province. And I think our long-term plan is to make sure that Nova Scotians have a government that represents all of them. And as a party, we strive to be a party that speaks for all Nova Scotians. And so I think we're just going to continue to grow from that strength that we already have. I think we are respected as doing that. I think we are seen as the voice of the people. And I think it's really important. We work for Nova Scotians. We don't work for our friends. We don't work for special interests. And, I was just having this conversation with a group of girl guides last night, actually, who were asking about the different parties. And I said, look, we're a young party. And part of the advantage of that is that we're not beholden to doing things the way they've always been done. And, we're living in a brave new world and things are changing every day and we're able to adapt to that and to make sure as much as we can that people have what they need to adapt to that. So we're just going to keep doing that work. And I think that our messages are really resonating with Nova Scotians. And I look forward to continuing to have those conversations in 2023.
All right. So do you feel as though the other parties are beholden to other forces outside of simply what's best for residents of citizens of Nova Scotia?
Well, I really believe that everyone, at least in the folks that I've encountered, I think that people get into politics and into public service for the right reasons. And I have a lot of respect for all of my colleagues on every side of the aisle, and I think they're probably all doing what they think is the right thing. But certainly, in the current government, we have heard from the Premier directly that he chooses his friends for senior public service positions. That those aren't my words, those are his. And, we definitely have evidence, if we look at the legacy of the, recent Liberal government, of lots of decisions being made that benefit, Liberal insiders, from the site of the, hospital in Bayers Lake to any number of other decisions. If you look at where infrastructure is built, if you look at, who gets appointed to committees, there is that kind of creeping partisan backroom sort of politics in the way that it's always been done here. So yes, I mean, by the evidence, it would seem so. But, I think we're trying to do things in a really different way. And as I say, we also don't have that legacy. So we have, I think, more freedom to do that.
When people think of the NDP, obviously people look at history, and it's not ancient history, but it's quite becoming quite far in the rearview mirror. But when Darrell Dexter and the NDP formed a government, is that a good thing? Do you think that the NDP did in fact have a government here in Nova Scotia, kind of getting over that threshold? Because we know in neighboring New Brunswick, the NDP have never gained any real traction there in that province. So is it a good thing or is it a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing, Todd. I mean, I think people will argue about what the legacy of our government was, but I think, the conversation I have with people lots is, well, the Liberals and the Tories have each been voted out of office dozens of times.
Yeah.
So, we got one shot, and I think we did a lot of good things, and I think we could have done things differently. I, of course, wasn't a part of that government or in office at that time. But absolutely, I think it's proof of concept. We are absolutely in a position to form government. We know what to do. We know how it works. We have that institutional memory. And, I think Nova Scotians know that, and I think we know that.
Right. So moving forward, I think healthcare, most people would agree, is probably the biggest mountain to climb for the current government. What role do you think that you can play in helping move this forward or improve the situation as a leader of the NDP?
Well, I think there are a few, Todd. I mean, I think one of the conversations we've been having a lot in the last 6 or 9 months, which seems to have resonated with government, is to point to our government, speaking of the NDP government, our legacy of creating collaborative emergency centers and collaborative care and really putting collaborative care on the map. And so for your listeners, that's, multidisciplinary care teams. So everyone knows that we have doctor shortages. Everyone knows that we have a labor shortage generally. And so it's more important than ever that all healthcare professionals can work to their full scope of practice. So if you have a medical issue that can be addressed by a nurse or a pharmacist or a physician's assistant, then you don't need to take up the time of the doctor. And you also shouldn't need to wait that long to see a doctor. You could see a different healthcare professional. So that's something that we have really been pushing the government to adopt and remember, and we're seeing some evidence of that. So we are seeing an expansion at Dow Family Medicine. Yesterday, we heard in committee that there is a commitment to hire, 250 folks to help with the surgical backlogs, and that includes multidisciplinary teams. So, I think that's one piece. But of course, as opposition, our primary goal is to hold the government to account and to hold them to their own promises and to provide that check and balance for the public. And what we know now is that they're actually not keeping any of their promises. And so, again, from the Premier's mouth, he coined himself a solutionist. And he had one campaign promise, and that was to fix healthcare. And that has not happened, and we have not seen evidence of that. And so I think that, what we are trying to do is to obviously we don't just want to be critics, we want to be generative. So we've provided lots and lots of legislative and policy suggestions, from collaborative care to it's really simple things like I think you and I have talked about in the past, waiving pharmacare fees so that, number one, we can make life more affordable for people, but number two, we can ensure that they take their medication and we can have those upstream interventions to keep people out of the hospital, to keep people away from the hospital, to have more expanded public health campaigns around vaccinations and masking and things that will, again, alleviate the pressure on our hospital system. But, just yesterday at Health Committee, we found that the government's promise to end the surgical backlog in 18 months has disappeared. Mm-hmm. And now that's a promise for 4 years down the road. As opposition leader, it's my job to amplify that to the public and say, this is why you voted for this government. This is what they promised you. It's not happening. And so, what can we do to ensure that it does happen? That's our role, and that's really what we are pushing on. And unfortunately, at the end of 2022, we have more people waiting for surgeries. We have more people waiting for a family doctor. We have evaporating promises and overstressed ERs. And so we're in a very, very challenging place as far as healthcare is concerned. And we want to make sure that solutions like the one we heard yesterday from Janet Hazelton around setting up a government travel nursing agency within Nova Scotia so we can take back some of those nurses who have opted for the private sector because it allows them better compensation and more flexibility. We need to see that in kind of innovation, and we also need some transparency around those promises. So that's a big part of our workload in that area.
All right, and environmentally, this government has a very, very ambitious climate reduction goals, and it's got quite a detailed plan. Also, is working on biodiversity as well. And do they get some props when it comes to the climate?
Yeah, I would say the record is mixed. So I think the legislation is pretty good and the goals are pretty good. But since they brought that bill in, which was the first bill of their government, the Environmental Climate Change Reduction Act, Environmental Goals and Climate Change Reduction Act, we have been pressing them for an actual plan. So how are they going to meet those targets? Because the targets sound great. And I think it is worth celebrating that in Nova Scotia we have all-party commitment to robust climate targets. But the proof is in the pudding. And this is a government that has actively campaigned against things like a carbon tax, which, while controversial, we all knew was coming. And so if they couldn't come up with an alternative, then it was pretty incumbent upon them to figure out how they were going to make it work. And they really buried their heads in the sand on that one. And so now we have a carbon tax that nobody really wants, and nobody really knows how to deal with it, particularly small businesses, which will be hit very hard. I think, we were glad to see more protected areas. That was a recent announcement and an important one. But at the same time, they're, entertaining a conversation around selling off a big chunk of a protected area, the West Mabu Beach, to a private developer to build a golf course. So as I say, I think that our goals are good. I think that, some of the actual actions of the government put those goals in direct jeopardy. And I think the current game of chicken that they're playing with Nova Scotia Power is another one on that list. So Nova Scotia Power has now said they won't do any work towards the Atlantic Loop. They have said publicly, we will not meet our 2030 commitments to get off coal. That's a legislated commitment. So Nova Scotia Power went and said, we're going to break the law. I'm not sure what the government's going to do about that. And I think their kind of heavy-handed approach has gotten us into this incredibly adversarial situation instead of doing the heavy lifting and figuring out a way to change the regulatory system so that we can get what we need. So I think we'll see. I think the jury's out on all of that, Todd, but it's a mixed record at the moment from my perspective.
Claudia, appreciate your time, and perhaps we'll talk again before Christmas and the New Year. If not, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Thank you so much.
Merry Christmas to you. Have a wonderful season.
All right, take care. Claudia Chender, leader of the NDP, and we're working on other year in review interviews as well. I've got to request